Welcome to all the creative writers of this course. I'm Sanam Khanna from Kamla Nehru College, University of Delhi, and I'm continuing with Block 2, Structures of Material, Unit 1. We discussed the genesis of themes in the earlier video, and now we will move on and spend more time with the idea of preparation for writing. Our focus in the earlier section was how to begin to write, and we looked at really sorting out your emotions, your feelings, your impulses, what leads you to write. And therefore, we covered the introduction to what is creative impulse, what are its origins, how is it related to the theme that you select, how to test the genuineness of your creative impulse. And of course, we discussed how genuine art is different from propaganda, and therefore the creative impulse is distinct, is different from social and political motivations. So let's move on today to the idea of how does one prepare for writing. Once you've got the idea, you've got a theme, how do we actually write it out? What are the mechanics of writing? We all know that we've learned it right from the time that we began writing essays, but it's worth it to go back and look at it. We talk of composing. Sometimes you just write the idea as it comes to you and you finish, let it work its course, but then you have to organize and edit. Any good piece of writing is never complete without organization and editing. And as you are a creative writer, you need to be extremely familiar with the basic terms of creative writing, which are theme, plot, character, location, or the creation of atmosphere, and of course, conflict and resolution. How is the action in your story or poem going to work out? So one of the best starting points for a creative writer is collecting the facts and look at how do you want to create a character, location, and story. Where are you going with this? How are you going with this? Where are you going with it? So once you have a story or theme in mind, you need to research things like place and time. For example, if it's a story that's a little before your time, suppose you are writing about, you've heard something interesting from your parent and you want to write about that event or incident, you will need to be accurate about such things as the historical condition, the social condition, small little details, how much, if you're your father, suppose the story is about your father and mother meeting for the first time, where did they meet, what was the cost of the items that they shared, if they shared a meal together. So these little details which give your story authenticity, you need to gather them and have them with you. How much of it you actually use may vary, but you still need to gather them before you start. You may not use each detail, but it helps give you clarity and provide a sense of background. Above all, it gives you the confidence that you are proceeding with a certain degree of authenticity and commitment to your idea. So the three most important factors for creativity, it is said, are experience, observation, and imagination. And sometimes, students ask me, which one comes first? And you will see in every creative piece that you work on, they'll be there in different proportions. Sometimes the imaginative aspect may be paramount, somewhere experience may be paramount. It depends on how your story is proceeding, and you'll find that as you create the story, the proportion will vary. The form, theme, tone, atmosphere, and characters will more or less be based on your imagination. So like I said, you may be writing a story about the first time your parents met, but your father may not be quite just your father. He may be an amalgamation of people that you know, because you're creating, after all, a fictional character and you want to bring in interesting details. Your mother may be a combination of your mother, your aunt, her mother. You want to bring in little character traits that you've observed maybe in somebody else, but you want to add it. So that's going to be where imagination fuses things and brings them into being. But authenticity, like I said, depends on research, and aesthetic taste is built by reading. So in other words, when you are writing, you are both researching and reading a lot of other stuff in order to make sure that your reading and your writing become aesthetically not just acceptable, but perhaps something that you yourself can admire. And William Faulkner, a very famous novelist, says, read, read, read. Read everything. It doesn't matter. Sometimes people will, especially your parents and teachers, will say, read classics. Faulkner says, read trash, classics, good and bad. See how they do it. Because it's very important to see what's bad as well as to see what's good. He says, when a carpenter learns his trade, he does so by observing. So now, in other words, what he's trying to say is writing is not very different. It needs to be learned. There's an art to writing which may be inborn, but there's also a craft which can be developed. Read, you will absorb it, and then write. So once you've decided to start writing, as I said, you must read, research, plan. And how do you do this? You must organize your research, and there are many ways in which to do it, and you have to find what works best for you. You may just keep a folder where you put in all the interesting articles, tidbits, ideas that have come to you, things you've jotted down in the middle of the write, or you could keep a journal, you could keep notes, like I said, you could keep a sketchbook. If you are at in an advanced stage of planning your work, your stories kind of now fully formed in your mind, you may like an idea board. So all of these are ways in which it can be done, and it's really up to you to find what works for you. And to find what works for you, you must experiment preferably with these methods to find what really appeals to you and what keeps you going. So this is Linda Fairbairn's storyboard, and you can see she has sketches, she has details of characters, who met where, who walked from where to where, what did they meet, and this is her way of kind of distilling for herself the atmosphere, location, and the basic story. So this is something that's called an idea board or a storyboard. This may work for you. You may have something simpler, more complicated. If you're like me and terrible at sketching, I don't sketch, I put little pictures. It's up to you, whatever works. Or you may have a journal. For example, here you can see they've put in some of their own writing, clips, photographs, envelopes, ticket stubs, whatever works for you, whatever you find interesting, put it together. You might use it, perhaps not today, maybe 10 years later, but it's there. The ideas then are collected for you. So again, I'm using Linda Barry, who I'd mentioned last time, creative writer, creative artist, but also creative writing coach. And she says, and she has these interesting ideas, schedule a time for writing. She says, find your space. You might find that you work best on your table with the door shut. Some people like to go out and sit in a park when they write. Other people might say, okay, I work best when I'm sitting near a crowded street, watching people. That's where my ideas come to me. You have to find that ideal space. At different times and stages of your writing, different spaces might work for you. But unless you know what works for you, you won't know why you are distracted or not being able to move further. Organize your writing, as I've already said. And something that works very well, according to Linda Barry, is setting daily targets. And if you see the page from her writing journal, she says there are ways in which you can do it. You can set a timer and say, I'll write for 10 minutes, I'll write for 7 minutes, I'll write for 2 hours, whatever moves you into writing. You may say, I will write so many pages. So it's really up to you. But her idea is you will get better only if you practice every day. And that's something that many writers repeat. And Faulkner says, when you're inspired, write a lot. But when you have an inspiration, put it down. Don't wait until later. When you have more time, then try to recapture the mood and add flourishes. But he says, when you're not inspired, still write a little each day at least. Don't be a writer, he says. Instead, be writing. So it's a process, not an event. Now let's come to the idea that how do you come to the idea that you want to write and what do you want to write about? And the themes are ageless. You can look at something like the Odyssey written 1,000 years ago, the Mahabharata written perhaps even older than that, something more recent, but the basic themes remain the same. The quest, the adventure story, the coming of age story, romance or love, death. An ageless theme is good versus evil. You may have individual and society, the conflict between them, power and corruption, survival, courage and heroism, either in exceptional circumstances, apocalypse, or even just personal tragedy, and of course, war. All of these themes you're familiar with, you've met them again and again, but what matters is how do you channelize them? And there's this illustration that you can see which says the theme is like the bottom of the iceberg. It's what you don't see. It's not in your face, but the story, the events and the plot, the characters, how they act out, what they do, all of this will really depend on the theme and what you've chosen. So once you have a theme in mind, how do you test whether to go ahead on it or not? The first criteria is sustainability. Once you've decided, you need to ask yourself, can I write a full story or a novel or a poem, whatever it is that you've decided to write? Can the theme sustain itself for this creative piece? And let's see what is a creative piece. A creative piece should have an interesting opening, a hook, something we'll discuss in detail both here and in another unit. What's a hook? The opening, something that pulls the reader in. If there should be a conflict or complication, conflict meaning the tension between characters or a complication in the plot, the challenge which has to be overcome. And there's obviously always a resolution, the ending where everything is sorted out or not, as the case may be, but it should sustain the reader's engagement. So your theme should be such that it lends itself to this movement through the story or the poem. And you may think, does a poem have movement? Yes, it does. Even the poem is telling a story, but it's doing it in verse, while a novel or a short story is doing it in prose. The second criteria is originality. Now you may ask yourself, if all the themes have been repeated over the years, how does one be original? Now that's where you have to ask yourself, do I have something new to say, or do I have something to say which maybe has already been said before, but I'm going to say it in a new way? You may feel, how can I say something new? I'm constrained, I haven't seen war, or I haven't experienced tragedy, hopefully, or any of those little barriers that may come to your mind. Remember two things. Build on what you know. That's most important. And if there's something you want to write about, but you don't have first-hand experience, you can research. But ask yourself, am I doing something with this story or poem which is a contribution to the aesthetic experience of the reader or the listener? And that's how your two criteria, sustainability and originality, will help you go on with the theme you've chosen. So, like I said, hook, conflict resolution are basic movements in a plot. Plot, of course, to repeat, is the main event or main events in a creative piece which work together as a sequence to create meaning. Plot is what keeps your story or poem moving. The different sections have to have a cohesion, and plot provides that cohesion. Conflict and resolution will obviously depend on the theme you have chosen and, of course, the mood you have chosen. If it's a tragic story, for example, the resolution will be something that is not a happy one. If it is a comedy, or if it is something that is you want to create an effect which is positive, then you will have a happy ending. But that's up to you. You have to let the theme guide you onto the conflict and resolution. The most fun part, of course, is creating the hook. And one of the most famous ones is Charles Dickens' in Tale of Two Cities, where he says it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It immediately, the paradox there makes you want to read further. And it's a huge novel, but once he's got you hooked on that first line, you have to go further. Stephen King, the very famous novelist and who's written a lot of horror stories, says the opening line is the most crucial element. It should invite the reader to begin the story. It should say, listen, come in, you want to know about this. He says it sets a tone, no matter what the length of the text is. And he also talks about creating a voice, finding a voice, which is how you are going to connect with your audience. And he says it should be an intimate connection, a bond much stronger than the kind forged intellectually through crafted writing. So the reader should not feel that this is fiction or should not be able to maintain, if you're writing well, that kind of distance. He should be pulled into the story, drawn into the story, and then continue with the excitement of reaching the end. Let's look at some famous hooks. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. Look at how that immediately catches your attention. This is 1984 by George Orwell. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen has that very famous line, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of wife." It sets the tone, that ironical kind of mocking tone that the novel is famous for. And there's the fantasy, speculative fiction novel by Ursula Le Guin, Left Hand of Darkness, which begins, "I'll make my report as if I told a story, for I was told as a child on my home world that truth is a matter of the imagination." Look at how she's challenging the concept of story, of truth, of what is truth, what is memory, but she does it so easily in that first line. Let's also look at, of course, themes for poetry. What is poetry? It's worth reminding yourself that it's a genre of literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response, and here's the important part, through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. So it's a specialized, concentrated, and most importantly, aesthetic use of language. So in one sense, writing poetry is like creating a painting, but with words. The themes for poetry are much the same as themes that you found when you were writing a short story or a novel. The themes of literature, the themes of all great art remain the same. What changes is the form. And let's look at how different poets have defined poetry. Frost says, poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and thought has found words. And Auden's is a lovely definition. Poetry is the clear expression of mixed feelings. He's of course being ironic, but in one sense he's not wrong. Poet Maya Angelou, whom we'll meet later, says, poetry is music written for the human voice. So it should evoke in that sense the same emotions as music evokes in you. Rita Dove says, poetry is language at its most distilled and most powerful. And that, I think, is a very, very telling phrase when she says language distilled and powerful. Those two aspects must come out in a good poem. And that's why Thomas Gray says, poetry is thought that breathes and words that burn. So you're seeing how different poets are saying that it's a strong emotive response that poetry evokes, but it also appeals to the imagination, to the mind. It somehow makes you look at language and understand the power of language. So like I said, the themes remain the same, the form changes. So in poem, the opening lines are as important as the hook in a novel or a short story. The statement has to grip the reader's thought and imagination in an instant. And it's important, therefore, to select your theme, your vocabulary, and your tone at the onset of the poem itself. How are you saying this poem? Why are you writing this poem? And as I said, language is metaphorical, symbolic, and it conveys emotions or ideas. And like a short story or a novel, the poem can also have a twist. It can have a surprise ending. It can make you rethink the beginning compared to the end. And That's how a good work of art stays with you, because it appeals to your imagination. It makes you see things in a new way. Let's look at some poems to see how they function, just as we looked at the opening lines of short stories to see how they functioned. So I'm looking at Still I Rise by Maya Angelou, a very famous poem. I'm sure you've heard it before. Look at the first few verses which I've put here and the ending of the poem. Look at the conclusion. She says, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise." Now, if you know a little bit about Black history, about slave history in America, you know immediately what she's referring to. But even if you don't, the emotions come through in that first verse. And look at the way she addresses. This is what we talk about finding a voice. She is writing in the first person. She's speaking to the audience, to the reader, in that very direct, confrontational way. She says, "Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes," because that's how a slave is meant to be. That's what she's asking. "Shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries." Look at that phrase, shoulders falling down like teardrops. Look at the image that they evoke. And then you'll understand what I was talking about, how language is symbolic, metaphoric, and also condensed. And how does she end the poem? She says, "Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I beat in the tide." Now, even if you are not familiar with the history of the poem, the history of blacks and slavery in America, that poem, the last few lines are creating such a strong emotional connect. The past that's rooted in pain. In that sense, she's making it for each reader who has, and everyone's experienced pain and humiliation in some way or the other. She's kind of combining all those experiences, putting the small picture and the big picture together in her poem. And look at the ending. "Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise." And this is something that poetry does by repetition, what's called the chorus or the refrain, the repetition of certain words and phrases. It creates this very strong effect, which is not just rhythmic, but also very, very powerful emotionally. Let's look at another poem by Kamala Das, an Indian author, and this one is called Summer in Calcutta. "What is this drink but the April sun squeezed like an orange in my glass?" Let's pay attention to this phrase, the April sun squeezed like an orange in my glass. What do you think she's talking about? Is she talking about nimbu pani? Is she talking about the golden tea without milk? It could be any number of things. But the phrase that stands out for you is the April sun squeezed like an orange into the glass. "I sip the fire, I drink and drink. Again, I am drunk. Yes, but on the gold of suns." So this idea of the heat outside, summer can be really oppressive. But she's turning it into an almost magical experience. "What noble venom," she says, "now flows through my veins and fills my mind with unhurried laughter. My worries doze." This whole idea of, how you start feeling sleepy in the sun if you've been sitting there for too long, and how it's creating in her this sense of slumber but also power. "Wee bubbles," she says, "ring my glass like a bride's nervous smile." Now, who would have thought of bubbles in a glass being compared to a bride's nervous smile? But Kamala Das does it so beautifully. "Dear, forgive this moment's lull in wanting you, the blur in memory. How brief the term of my devotion, how brief your reign, when I, with glass in hand, drink, and drink again this juice of April's sun. So what she's saying in a way is that the moment is obliterating all other memories. But what's important here, and I would urge you to reread this poem on your own and dwell a little on the words and phrases and the magical way in which she uses language. So let's recap now. In Block 2, Unit 1, we discussed the genesis of themes and we discussed the preparation for writing. How do we prepare for writing? We look at the creative impulse, we identify it, we recognize motive, we are honest with ourselves, we figure out why we want to write and how we want to write. Mechanics of writing, which is the how and the why coming together in concrete form. We become familiar with writing concepts and conventions, the terms that go into creative writing, and we set up the routine. The importance of routine I cannot stress enough. It's really important that you find what works for you. If you can, write daily. If you can't write daily, at least set up a time, weekly, monthly, more often if possible, where you do write. How do we select a theme for a short story or a poem or any creative piece? Two factors are important: sustainability of theme and the originality of handling. So these are things that you need to keep in mind. You also need to look at and consider the importance of research and the importance of maintaining authenticity. So that if it's all research but you aren't being able to create a personal connect, if you don't feel for the character or the issue or the location, if you aren't able to recreate that authentically, then it won't be an interesting piece of writing. On the other hand, if it's too emotional, if you've gone into something without adequately researching it, it will not ring true once you are done with the writing. So both have to be balanced. So writing and creative writing is really a sort of balancing act between these various factors. As we conclude, in the next unit, we will discuss the importance of opening, something I've touched upon in this section as well, the writing of hooks, but we will do it with more practice. We'll discuss genres and conventions and narrative modes of writing. And what I want to leave you today with is this idea. Again, Stephen King on how to be a writer. If you want to be a writer, you must do two things above all others. Read a lot and write a lot. And if you do the two and stay true to your writing plan, I'm sure you'll come up with something that satisfies not just you, but readers outside as well. Thank you for today.